Egoism, ethical egoism.
You were talking about it's the belief that whatever in your best interest.
Yeah, let me write that back.
People should do it.
I'm sorry, go ahead. What?
You were saying that egoism is the belief that whatever is in that person's best interest, they should do it.
Yeah, that's what's right for that person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The question I wanted to ask was, how can somebody of the same belief judge what's truly in a person's best long-term interest?
The idea is that what's right for a person is whatever is in that person's best long-term interest. And your question is, how could anyone other than that person make a judgment about this? Well, a couple of different ways, but it doesn't, even if it were the case that the only person who could know that would be the person himself or herself, it still would be possible for that person to be wrong. I mean, not everything that that person might think is in his or her best interest would necessarily be in it. I mean, after all, in my own case, I mean, I can speak autobiographically, but I think probably everybody else could say the same. There have been lots of times when I've made decisions which I thought at the time were in my best interest, but later on I came to believe that I had been mistaken. I said, that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. I was wrong. So even if the very best authority about what's in your best interest is you, that still doesn't mean that you can't be mistaken about it. And in fact, the idea that the best authority on what's in your best interest is you, that really is kind of what ethical egoists really think. Now, let's just look at that, though. It could be that occasionally some other person, perhaps someone, for example, who knows you very well, might actually make a more accurate assessment of what's in your best interest than you do. This sometimes happens too, when you later on come to see that. But you can't rely on this, and I think what the egoist would argue is just what you suspect. They'd say, well, you know, when you're in doubt, if you're trying to figure out what's right, you have to figure out what's in your best interest. And why, even though you might be wrong, you're the best judge. Ethical egoism really is about you yourself, each person himself or herself. Now, does that clear it up, or does that just further confuse it? I want to try and rehearse at least the overview of what we've been doing, just sort of generally to get us back kind of on the roll, back in the into the discussion. We've been looking at ethical theory, and the question we've been focusing our attention on all the way through is, what is it that makes right things right? What is it that determines the rightness of things that are right? The relativists said nothing more than social decree, social opinion, at least in the case of the social relativists. And the individualist relativists said nothing more than individual belief. That's what determines right and wrong. Before I move on, I want to let you know that I've done some inquiring. I was dissatisfied with the ambiguity of which tribe did what in that little story I told. And while it won't be on your test or anything like that, I just wanted to let you know that I was wrong about both of those tribes. The tribe that had the view that the war party should stay outside of camp whenever a warrior was lost, that was the Crow Nation, the Crow tribe. And they lived at the time in sort of the Wyoming, Montana area, I believe. Now, I didn't check this in the most primary sources, but I did look it up in what secondary sources I could find. And it wasn't just one night, I learned. It turns out that the Crow war party, if a warrior was lost, was supposed to stay out 10 days. 10 days. It's a long time. And then the Contrast tribe could have been any tribe that didn't have that custom, I suppose, but the Contrast tribe that I was able to pinpoint was not the Navajo or the Arapaho, it was the Apache, and the Apache tribe was indeed from the Southwest, where I thought the whole story came from. But so it's the Crows and the Apaches that should be contrasted, if anybody cares. But just for the sake of accuracy, I thought I would look it up, and that's the information I got. Anyway, relativists said that what's right and what's wrong is strictly a function of belief, and then the whole crowd of absolutists are simply defined as people who object to that, who say that's not right. There's something more than just belief for ethical statements to be true to. There is something for them to be true to. It's not just whatever a society or an individual says. And then what we're going to do today, and it looks like next time, a little bit, today and then moving a little bit into next time, we're going to talk about some particular versions of absolutism. We began with egoism. All of these different versions are attempts to answer the question, the very reasonable question, what beyond belief is it that determines the difference between right and wrong? And the ethical relativist, the individualist ethical relativist, said what's right is what a person believes, an individual believes to be right. And here we have ethical egoism, which I'm telling you is an absolutist position. It says what's right is what's in a person's best interest. What's right for any particular person, any one of us, is whatever is right, whatever is in our own best interest. What's the difference? What's the difference between individualistic ethical relativism on the one hand and ethical egoism on the other? I ask this because I suspect that it might be a little bit confusing. Yes?
Might it be that ethical egotism is...
A little louder. I'm sorry, I have to keep asking.
Might it be that ethical egotism believes that a person has a belief because it's going to benefit them in the long run, and individual relativism sort of believes that it's just simply their belief, and that's that?
I think you may have it. I mean, but the difference is that the ethical egoist argues that sometimes people's beliefs about what's right can be mistaken. That's what makes them absolutists. I mean, what's right and wrong doesn't depend upon belief alone. Sometimes what people believe to be right may very well be mistaken. How can that be if what's right is what's in a person's best interest? Anyway, how could it be possible to be mistaken about that, about what's right? Let's say I think that it's right to do, just about anything. Skip class one day. Let's say I've got an alternative between spending my money on a new CD, or I can give my money to a charity, or I can give my money to somebody else who might use it in some other way. What the egoist says is that I'm to make the decision based on what's in my best interest. So imagine yourself in a situation like that, deciding one way or the other what's right, trying to decide what's right. How might you go wrong? Or couldn't you? Anybody?
What may be in your best interest at that time is not going to be in your best interest down the road, possibly.
Okay, so I might mistake short-term for long-term best interest. And what the egoist has said, I keep saying it, I don't think that I wrote it down either this time. I certainly didn't write it down this time, but I don't believe I wrote it down last time. But I keep saying that the egoist says that we have to assess what's in our best long-term interest. And sometimes we make mistakes about that. We choose things that might gratify us or be in our interest in the short term, but aren't necessarily in our long-term interest. That's just one way to go wrong about what's in our interest. What we think is in our interest need not really be. As I say, I mean, it seems to me that in each of our own case, you can think back at times where you thought something was in your best interest. That was your best judgment at the time, but you later learned that that was a mistake. I mean, you did the best you could in trying to figure out what's in your best interest, but plainly, your guess about what's in your best interest might be mistaken for all kinds of reasons, one of them being you might be mistaking short-term interest for long-term interest. But there's another way it can go wrong as well, and this is one of the ways that in which I think some of the most influential egoist, ethical egoist, not egotist, by the way, but egoist, no T in the middle. Some of the most influential egoist authors think that we often go wrong in our opinions about what's right because we've been brainwashed by another crowd that I'll call here, I'm going to use a different color because that orange seems like it's kind of hard to see. Ethical altruism. And I'm going to try and cast this. I warned you about how these positions get cast when they're compared and contrasted with one another. But I'll put this at something of an extreme and say that what's right, according to the altruists, is what's in the best interests of others. And indeed, what ethical altruists are likely to say, at least if they, characterized in this way, what altruists are likely to say is that when we're trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong, we should set aside personal interest. We should set aside selfishness. That indeed we have to try and forget about our own interests if what we want to do is to figure out what's right and what's wrong. What's right and what's wrong, according to the altruist, is completely independent of our own selfish or self-centered, self-oriented interests. One altruist view might have it that we should care no more for our own children, for example, than for the children on the other side of the planet. To care for our own children more than the ones on the other side of the planet might be due merely to selfishness. And this would not be a morally acceptable motivation. If the altruist were to agree that maybe we really should devote more attention to our own children than the ones around the other side of the planet, it would have to be for some non-selfish reason. Like, for example, this. Our own children are people who we really are in a position to help directly, whereas it would be difficult for us to help directly people on the other side of the planet. In order to help starving kids in Bangladesh, for example, we have to make use of mediating institutions, charitable institutions, governments, so that our efforts to help wind up getting watered down as our resources get passed to the other side of the globe. So that there are practical reasons for helping our own children first, and not the ones on the other side of the planet, but there aren't any particularly moral reasons why it would be okay to prefer helping our own children. Or maybe the altruist would argue we have special obligations, moral obligations to our own children because we brought them into the world. And that's why it might be all right, as far as the altruist is concerned, to care for them, to devote our resources to raising and caring for them rather than the ones on the other side of the planet, if we have only a finite amount of resources to spread around. The egoist says that all of this is nonsense. The reason why it's okay to care for your children more than you care for the ones around on the other side of the world and to take care of them is because they're yours and you love them more. It's because they are much more intimately involved with your own interests. And so the egoists say that's why it's not only okay, but I think egoists would often be horrified by the idea that you'd even consider taking resources that you could devote to your own children and spending it on children that you don't even know. Now, the confusing thing about all of these isms, these sort of abstract theoretical isms, is that you can never really predict very clearly what particular solution the ism leads to in particular cases. All you can know for sure, and this is all that really matters at this theoretical level, is what the egoist or the altruists say is the thing we should be looking at if we're trying to figure out what's right. The egoists say that when you're trying to figure out what's right, look to your best interest, your own. And the altruists, characterized in this particular way anyway, say that no, in order to figure out what's peculiarly right, ignore your own interest and look to the interests of others. That for the altruist, the right and the self-interested are opposed. For the egoist, they're united. Now, to show you why you can't necessarily draw conclusions about what it is that the egoist would say about particular instances, I just refer you back to something that I think we mentioned at the end of the last class, this dilemma about whether you should spend, a woman should spend her money on her child, for example, or on a new hat. It's not necessarily the case that the egoist would recommend that the woman should spend the money on her own hat, on a new hat. Indeed, the egoist might think that that's a peculiarly trivial expenditure and would be surprised that people would have that anyone might have such a limited interest in their own child. I mean, what each person should do is to further their own interests, and if their interest happens to be in the raising of their child, or even, in matter of fact, in sort of helping the hungry, if that really is what a person takes to be in their own interest, and if they're right about that, if that's what their own interest is, really, then that's what should be pursued. The important thing is not necessarily what the upshot is. The important difference and disagreement we have here is what is it that makes things right? And for the egoist, what makes things right is that they are in your interest. What makes things wrong is that they are not. For the altruist, it's quite different. Okay, any questions or comments about egoism? Yeah.
Just a general thing, this kind of looking inwards and looking outwards perspective of each. Looking at an individual point of view, I could see it working, but when you get to everyone doing it as a society, I would have thought it would be an absolute mess.
Yeah, egoism.
Yeah. I think it can go both ways, even ethnic altruism.
Altruism might be a complete mess as well.
Everyone patting each other on the back.
They're competing with one another to give more than their neighbors. No, you can't give. I have to give to you. No, you have to give to me.
I can see that being an absolute mess, and I think, like we said in the previous issue, the combination of the two, I think, has to balance each other.
Well, I'd be wary of thinking that you can combine them. I mean, again, I'm
trying to draw a line there.
Right. I want to a good reason to I mean, there are lots of bad reasons about this, and I think I outlined them in perhaps the first lecture in sort of always sort of having these polar opposites that you have to choose from. One reason to do things this way is that it makes your disagreement with the positions a bit clearer. I think rather than try to combine egoism with altruism, I think it's probably profitable to say, look, I reject both of them. I mean, I think that perhaps your position is that you can't see how either of these positions, so described, how either of them could be right. Each one of them seems to create problems, and that the right view will be something that isn't nearly as, it certainly that doesn't limit itself in the ways that these two do. And that's certainly one of the reasons that's led people to move beyond egoism to the other positions that I want to discuss, and to ones that I'm not going to discuss. Another problem with egoism is that it doesn't make much progress away from relativism. Some of the things that led people to be dissatisfied with relativism I discussed last week, but one important thing is that it doesn't really talk about ethics in a recognizable way. For egoists, it would seem that if, as surely might happen sometimes, if your interest contrasts with my interest, then what you ought to do is to pursue yours, and I ought to pursue mine. If it turns out, now again, that's a big if, but if it turns out that it's in our interest to fight, then that's what we should do. Maybe we should. Maybe it won't be in our interest. Maybe if we're, I mean, if we're each more or less evenly matched, it will be in our interest not to fight, but to compromise. But the ethical theory doesn't tell us about whether we should compromise or not. It just says, do what's in your best interest. The level at which this is a universal principle is very abstract. It says, what's right for each person X is what's in that person X's best interest. Now that's as universal as you please, but that's because people occur as variables in there. It doesn't tell us anything more about what's right than that we should each pursue our best interests. It doesn't tell us in particular what those interests might be. It may make some assumptions along those lines, but it doesn't say that there's any particular things that are right or wrong, any particular kinds of things that are right or wrong, beyond that they be in our genuine best interests. So that's troubled people. Also, it's troubled people because it seems not to be much like ethics and morality as we normally understand them. We normally understand, or many people do, they think that ethics and morality is first and foremost some set of rules that's supposed to guide interpersonal behavior. It's supposed to be directed to our obligations to others, our rights with respect to others. It's supposed to have to do, first and foremost, with our relationships with other people. And ethical egoists believe that that this can fall out, that they can develop a universal sort of social ethic based on individual rights that comes from egoism, but not everyone else has been convinced. To lots of people, egoism seems like an appropriate ethic for Robinson Crusoe, isolated on his desert island there. But it tells us very little about what should be done once Robinson Crusoe and Friday are both on that island, or what we're to do when we have conflicts. I want to repeat the same caution that I repeat about every single one of these positions. Ethical egoists have responses that are fairly sophisticated to this sort of criticism. But it's this sort of criticism that's led people to search elsewhere. Some people are committed ethical egoists. Others have felt that there's something inadequate about the theory, and they have looked elsewhere for, I guess I'll keep this down there, they've looked elsewhere for something more satisfactory in the way of an ethical theory. There are three theories that I want to devote some time to today. If we're successful, that will mean we can go immediately in the next session to considerations of professional ethics proper, but this may carry over a little bit into the next lecture, I'm not sure. But the three positions that I want to discuss are virtue-based approaches to ethics, consequence-based approaches, and rights-based approaches. All three of these are further efforts to answer the question, what is it that makes things right, if not just social opinion? Okay? All right, now, we'll do these one by one. Virtue-based approaches are associated first and foremost with Aristotle. More recently, Alistair McIntyre has written a number of works in which he thinks that we should return to a virtue-based approach to ethics. It is different from the other two, the consequences-based approaches and the rights-based approaches, in that this one focuses attention on how a person should be. I mean, and it thinks that there are some features beyond mere social belief or assertion that can inform us how a person should be. This one focuses on how a person should be, whereas both consequence-based and rights-based approaches, they focus on what sorts of things we should do, what sorts of actions we should perform. So that's what egoism did as well. Egoism said we should do those things which further our best interests. Consequentialism will later say we should do those things which have the best overall consequences. And rights-based theories say that we should do those things which avoid violations of individual rights. And that's the way we should focus our attention. Yes?
Based approaches to ethics, did you sum it up like you did the last two, consequences and rights-based?
Did I do which one?
Based approaches.
There's nothing that's just based approaches.
Okay,
There's
okay. No,
virtue-based approach. Yeah, that's the one I'm going to start with. Okay, the virtue. But I said that what characterizes it particularly is that it talks about what kinds of characteristics a person should have, what kind of person one should be. Let me start out by looking at this word virtue in connection with its Greek meaning. We're working with a term that is a translation, at least when we're working with the Greeks like Aristotle and Plato, we're looking at a word that's a translation of a Greek term, arete. Virtue comes kind of close in most contexts, but it's not quite the same. It doesn't work quite the same way in English as arete did in Greek. For one thing, virtue we're normally used to thinking of as being really intimately connected with ethics and morals, first and foremost. And we wouldn't think, for example, that something like a lectern or a visualizer or a microphone or a camera could be virtuous. I mean, we'd kind of laugh if somebody started talking about a virtuous lectern. And we could talk about a good lectern in English. This is a good one, and oppose it to a bad one. So we do use value terms hooked up with inanimate objects, but usually not the term virtuous. Maybe it would make some sense to say, to ask the question, what are the virtues of a good lectern? I mean, that might make some sense in English, but still it would seem a little bit awkward. You wouldn't expect to hear it anywhere except maybe in a philosophy class or something like that. But the Greeks used the term arete in just this fashion. For them, virtue means nothing more than factors, virtues would be factors contributing to excellence. Any factors contributing to excellence. Now, since the factors that contribute to excellence among lecterns are different from the factors that contribute to excellence among television sets, for example, this has got to be relativized to a certain extent. So, virtues are factors contributing to excellence among things of some specified type. So you get to talk about the virtues of a lectern, the virtues of a knife. The Greeks didn't talk too much about television sets and microphones, but you can get the general idea. The virtues of a chair. I mean, what are the qualities in a chair that make a chair a good chair? What are the qualities in a knife that would make a knife a good knife? These are the virtues. Is that clear? Are there any questions about that? Virtues can be applied to things both animate and inanimate, and they do not specifically necessarily refer to the properties that we would think of as being ethical or moral. Yes?
What would happen if the object was used in an evil way? Like, say, the knife was used to kill someone. Would it be considered bad?
Those things they bedeviled the Greeks. Plato talked about this issue in terms of forms. He thought each kind of thing, chairs, tables, and whatnot, had their own form, ideal form, and it's this ideal form that the artisan imitates whenever he tries to make a chair. And then people would say to him, or he, I guess, said to himself, I have to give him credit, he raised this question about his own theory in one of his dialogues. He said, well, gee, what's the form of fingernail clippings? What's the form of dirt? And so he'd ask about things that really, it was hard to sort of think of perfection in terms. And I think you're asking something of the same kind. Like you're saying, what would be? I mean, I guess I don't know quite what the question would be. I mean, the question would be something like, what would be, from the point of view of the murderer, what would be the virtues of a gun? Well, I mean, you can actually start talking about these things, things that would make, a silencer on it, like accuracy and stuff like that. But I think what the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, what they would want to say is that there are some properties that things have that actually transcend any particular use that you might make of them. So that if we ask about the gun, we don't have to specify what it's going to be used for. We can just talk about it ought to be well balanced. If it's a handgun, it ought to balance in the hand, and we don't have to say, because the things that make it good for murdering might make it a good gun in general. But you've hit on a problem that at some level is going to bedevil any such theory that talks about essential properties that things have. It's a little easier to resolve if you're dealing with things like this. I mean, the chair that's the ideal chair that for classroom use may not be the same chair as you'd like to have in your living room when you're just wanting to relax at the end of the day. I mean, if you had a big fluffy chair, reclino loungers in there, while you might enjoy sitting in them a little bit better than the ones you're sitting in now, it might not really facilitate what this room is supposed to facilitate, namely listening to what's being said. So you could say, all right, well, we have to distinguish between bar stools, classroom chairs, and reclino loungers. They'll have different local sets of virtues. They'll all share some general ones, like they're supposed to support the weight of a human being. I mean, that's what all of them are supposed to do. But then these different kinds within the category chair, they have their own special virtues. We could go on and on about this. There's all kinds of problems with this sort of theory in trying to describe things. But right now, getting back here to ethics, all I wanted to do is to clarify that this term had a slightly broader meaning for the Greeks than it might to us in English. Virtues aren't just ethical properties, and they don't just pertain to people or to acting, thinking beings. Virtues also are shared by inanimate objects. And they might be stuff like sharpness in a knife, or ability to bear weight in a chair, or in the case of a lectern, the ability to support papers at a height from which they may be read by the speaker. I mean, you can get kind of complicated here, but those would be the virtues of these various things. Okay? Now, then the question, the moral ethical question is, all right, what, or at least one of them would be, what are the virtues of a person? What are the virtues of a human being? I mean, what are the properties or characteristics or factors that make for excellence in a human life? And you'll get the normal ones that you'd expect, the normal ethical and moral ones, like it's better, it's superior to be honest rather than dishonest, benevolent, it's better to be benevolent rather than stingy. The normal lists of things that you would expect people to think of as being good features. But here, you'd also get these things on Aristotle's list, for example. It's better to be wealthy than poor. It's better to have some power within society than not. These are virtues. A virtuous person will be somebody who is not poor, who is fairly well educated, who is fairly intelligent and clever, and who has a considerable amount of social power. Now, these are not the kinds of things, I mean, they're not meant to be necessarily only ethical properties. These are just supposed to be things that it's better to have, better to be, than not to be. Now, the whole set of virtues has got to be internally balanced and consistent. So that, for example, while it's useful, it's good for a person to have financial resources, this must be balanced by the benevolence. It's important that a person be generous and benevolent. And indeed, I think Aristotle would have argued, unless you have some kind of resources, or some kind of, at least meager, some degree of power to do things, to act within society, then your wishes to be benevolent can't be carried out. In order to be benevolent, in order to be charitable, in order to help others, you have to have a certain amount of resources. So Aristotle would have argued that some of these virtues that we might be suspicious of, like power and wealth, that these things are actually necessary conditions for us to be able effectively to have some of the other virtues, the ones that are more normal. But in any case, what the list is supposed to be is a list of factors that make for excellence in human beings. And the Greeks argued about which things should be on that list, as you might expect. Some said, I'm quite sure, oh, I don't know about this political power, I don't know about this wealth, just as we might. I think it's very likely that some critics of Aristotle, even among his contemporaries, would say, you know, you certainly don't need to have wealth to be an excellent or a good person, a virtuous person. And I think Aristotle might agree with that, but might argue that nevertheless, it's better to have the wealth than not. Someone might argue, I think then as now, no, wealth might corrupt. Wealth is an endangerment to the other virtues. And I'm not sure exactly what Aristotle would say to that particular complaint. So there's room to disagree about which things are on this list of virtues. But if you are working in a virtue-based ethics, what you're trying to do is to figure out what's on that list. What are the characteristics that I should struggle to bring about in myself? What are the things I should aspire to? What kind of person should I be? And basically, I think part of the idea is that, well, then, if you are successful in building character, then the right acts will just kind of come along. I mean, you don't have to worry, you don't have to think about, you know, what should I do in this particular case. If you have the right kind of character, the right decisions are more likely to be made as they arise. And so the emphasis is on character, the emphasis is on virtues. Okay, clear, or anything need clarification? Comments? Yeah.
So somebody like Aristotle, who believes in virtue-based ethics, is at the same time an ethical absolutist.
Yes.
At the same time.
Why?
Well, because he says that the reason why this is a good quality of a human being is because it helps you in this way or that way. He doesn't just say because that's that.
He doesn't just say it's whatever you happen to think. Right. He bases it on something else. He says that this makes for a good life. He'll offer arguments. He's prepared to try and explain just exactly why these properties are better than those. And people who argue about them will offer their own reasons and their own evidence. But you see, what they're arguing about is something other than just what it is that you or I believe. It's supposed to have a basis that beyond belief. So that makes this position absolutist. And it's one of the, so was egoism. This is the second answer that we've discussed that tries to answer the question, what is it beyond beliefs of persons that makes the difference between right and wrong? Here the emphasis is on character, and it has to do with what it is that makes for a good life. Now, Aristotle himself, when asked the question, which things are the virtues, he was prepared to offer a list, but he didn't think this was an arbitrary list. As a general rule, he offered the following hint as to which things were virtues and which not. The rule of the golden mean. Okay. For Aristotle, what we should be is always a mean between extremes. So that, for example, we should be benevolent. That means we should give of ourselves to others. But we shouldn't give away everything. That's profligacy. That's a vice. To just sort of waste everything. To give it all away is to be a poor steward of the resources. On the other hand, to be stingy, to not give anything away, that's a vice too. Benevolence is the middle ground, the golden mean between profligacy on the one hand and stinginess on the other. And courage, that's a virtue too. But what's courage? Courage is the middle ground, or the golden mean between foolhardiness on the one hand, and cowardice on the other. And in general, Aristotle thought that if you want to know what the virtues are, you'll find them occupying this middle ground between extremes on every continuum. And that sounds kind of like it answers the question, what are the virtues? But it has proven to be unsatisfactory to some people anyway, because while it seems to give the answer to the question, it probably doesn't. It actually disguises some predisposition to think certain things are virtues and certain vices. So for example, let's say I ask myself, how many people should I kill as I embark on my mass murdering spree in Manhattan? Well, I should do what the golden mean suggested. Not too many and not too few. I should do somewhere right in the middle. Now that's a kind of a ludicrous example, but it shows that the golden mean idea all by itself isn't going to determine for us which things are virtuous and which things aren't, which things we ought to do and which things we shouldn't. There are some presuppositions at work about what's bad and what's good. And the question, which are the virtues, that's not answered by the golden mean. Almost anything, any activity that you choose to embark on probably could be couched as the golden mean between two other extremes. You see what I'm saying? So that if we hoped to answer the question, what are the virtues, by using this golden mean trick, that won't work. And so what the question about which are the virtues, what are the things that make for excellence in a human life, that question is kind of left free-floating by Aristotle's answer. Others argue almost relativistically that what should be pursued is, or what will be regarded as a virtue, is a condition of excellence that depends on the history of some practice. That what emerges in the history of some practice will be an evolving set of standards. And it's these standards that determine what the virtues are. That could be interpreted, that's a McIntyrean line that has something to do with what Alistair McIntyre says. That could be interpreted strictly relativistically, is to say that there is no further basis other than that it has happened to evolve as a standard in a particular practice within a particular society, and then we're back to relativism and all the complaints we had about it. Or it might be construed as a sign of some kind of deeper success. For example, the idea might be that nothing would survive as a practice in the ongoing life of society unless it had something good going for it, unless it had something that contributed to the life of the society in a positive way. Kind of an evolutionary argument that suggests not just that some things happen to evolve and some things happen to be accepted, but rather that evolution itself is a force for the good in some way. Now that's, again, a case that would have to be defended if it were to be plausible. And here too, lots of folks, while there are, as a matter of fact, there's a new, nearly a new fad of acceptance of virtue-based ethics. Nonetheless, not everyone finds virtue-based ethics attractive, partially because it seems so free-floating. And so what I want to turn next to are the other two theories, or approaches to ethics. Both of these, again, they're absolutist, and both of them are action-oriented. I mean, if you want to know what's right and what's wrong, the question is most appropriately raised about acts, not about personality characteristics or about human character. And what we have is consequentialism versus what I'm going to call internalism. Now, consequentialism is a pretty standard name for the one side of this pair. Internalism usually isn't used as the label for the other half. More often than not, this is called the deontological approach, or sometimes it's called Kantian, because one famous internalist was Immanuel Kant. And sometimes, in the way that I designated a few minutes ago, it's called rights-based. Because as often as not, it is based on rights. Consequentialism is sometimes called the teleological approach. That word's almost as bad as deontological, not quite as bad, but almost as bad. It's one reason for avoiding it. What it says is what's right depends on consequences. And this internalistic position I'm going to characterize as saying not only on consequences.
Does that say depends on consequences?
What's right and what's wrong depends on, now again, we're assessing actions once again, not on characters, although you could use consequentialism to assess personality characteristics, personality traits. We're not going to worry about that too much. We're going to focus our attention on our decisions, our efforts to decide which things are right and which things are wrong. And consequentialism says when we're in the middle of trying that, when we're trying to figure out which things are right and which things are wrong, what we should look at are the consequences of what we propose to do. That's what will tell us what's right and what's wrong. Let's get a little bit more specific by directing attention on a particular version of consequentialism that was advanced by Jeremy Bentham. And John Stuart Mill in the 1800s, called, can't fit it in there, Utilitarianism. I'll put this somewhere else so you can see it. We're going to okay, utilitarianism. And this is a particular version of consequentialism. Consequentialism is just as abstract as it sounded a moment ago. All it says is that what's right and what's wrong depends on the consequences of what you do. If you want to know what makes right things right, it's that they have good consequences. The particular version that I'm focusing attention on was advanced by Bentham and Mill. It's called utilitarianism. And just to summarize it briefly, it says that what we should be trying to promote, the particular consequences we should be trying to encourage, are the greatest good for the greatest number. Bentham and Mill disagreed to some extent on how to best word the utilitarian principle, but they had enough in common, so I think it's fair to lump them together. And then finally, for just a little bit more specificity, because you still might be saying, wait, I still don't get it, still don't see what we're supposed to do, they interpret this word good in terms of happiness, by and large, or pleasure. And by happiness or pleasure, they don't mean the kind of giddy, chuckly, giggly happiness. They mean the kind of a more abiding happiness that reflects genuine human contentment. And so, putting all of this together, what the utilitarians said, what these particular consequentialists said, was that if you want to know whether something's right, when you're trying to decide what to do in a particular situation, you should assess the consequences of the various alternatives open to you. And you should do that thing which promotes the greatest general happiness in the long run for the greatest number. Now, what that means is, you're likely to have, any situation you're in, you can have a bunch of different options, a bunch of different things you can do. It's never going to be very simple, like I can either do one of two things. Even thinking, even trying to do nothing, just standing there doing nothing, that's an act, that's a choice, and that's going to have consequences. In particular, you didn't do one of the other things you could have done. So, there's no getting out of it. No matter what you choose, it has consequences. And it will have effects on various persons. It will certainly have effects on you, and you get to count yourself. This is not altruism in the sense that we outlined it before. You do get to count yourself. But it'll have consequences for you, any particular choice that you make, and it'll have consequences for other people, directly and indirectly. So what you have to do when you're trying to figure out, my God, what's the morally right thing to do in this particular situation, you're supposed to look at all of the different consequences that each of your options would have for everybody who would be affected. Okay? And you're supposed to count every person equally. You can count yourself, but you only count as one. You can't kind of count yourself as two, or your own kids as two. Each of them count. Every person counts as one. And you add all of this up, and you've got something like, you'll have a scale, okay, of happiness is up here, unhappiness is down there, or sometimes it's supposed to be pleasure up there and pain down here. But anyway, you make a positive, negative scale, and you take each person, the effects on each person of every possible choice, you add them all together, and you choose that course of action which yields the highest total on this scale. Now that's kind of the ideal sketch of what utilitarianism recommends that we do. We're trying to maximize in our choices the overall consequences in terms of producing happiness. Okay, was there a question or comment?
Just summing up, just the altruistic view. I was wondering if you could just...
Back to altruism? This isn't...
Well, no, excuse me. This is the view we're talking
Okay, this is not altruism.
Right. As far as attributing happiness, you include yourself, you're automatically biased towards what you include.
Well, you're supposed to try not to be. You get that's the point. That's the part about you can count yourself as one. You're going to be affected in certain ways by each thing you choose. You get to throw that into the calculus. You're not supposed to ignore it. Altruism suggests, at least the way we've characterized it, altruism suggests you're supposed to ignore your own self-interest. Consequentialism says, no, that's not fair. You count just as much as anybody else, but you just don't count more. So you throw in, your own pain, your own pleasure, whatever is produced, and then you balance it with everybody else's, and then you take that course of action, quite apart from what the particular effect is on you. Here you're supposed to neglect, the fact that, well, you might notice that, well, this course of action, this is the best one for me, but it really isn't the one that promotes the greatest overall happiness. This act over here, well, this one's not so good for me, but it does promote the greatest overall happiness, all things considered. Well, this is the one you should do. As far as we're trying to remember, we're trying to figure out which is the morally right one. Utilitarians understand that this might not be easy to do, but after all we're trying to do is figure out what's the morally right thing to do, the ethically proper thing to do. It's the one that promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, there's a million different objections that people have had to this, and the first ones, I think, utilitarians had reasonable success. I'm less critical of utilitarianism and consequentialism in this regard than other people are. But for one thing, someone might say, they ask us to do something impossible. How in the world are we supposed to ever figure out what all the effects are on every possible person affected by each one of our possible decisions? We can't do this. We don't have access to even the beginnings of this information. It's hard enough to assess the consequences among people close to us of the things that we actually do. How are we supposed to assess the possible consequences to all persons who might be affected by all of our potential options? That's crazy. We couldn't do that. That's one objection. You can't possibly get this information. Second one might be, there's dozens of these. I've just got a couple on the top of my head. The second one might be, what on earth makes anybody think that even if we could get all this information, that that it's going to be consistent? Different persons, are affected by the same act to different extents as far as what makes them happy. Some people are easy to please, and some people are not easy to please. Are we supposed to take that in consideration or not? And if we are, how? And if not, why not? It might be that just doing some simple little thing would give somebody tremendous happiness. Whereas it might, this might be somebody over here who's very, very difficult to please indeed. And we'd have to work night and day, exhausting tremendous resources just even to nudge them up their happiness scale. Why should this be relevant? The extent to which we're producing happiness. Should we really exhaust all our resources in trying to make those who are difficult to please a little bit happier? That seems kind of odd. And then finally, there's been this objection, which is sort of intriguing, and that's that these things don't add. You make two people happy, you haven't really produced any more of anything than you would if you made one person happy. The idea is something like this. Only individuals can be happy or unhappy. Individuals. Groups don't get happy. You don't have, like a quart of happiness in the case of one person and then 5 quarts of happiness in the case of 5 people. You just get 5 people, each of whom have 1 quart of happiness. You got, what you got there is 1 quart of happiness. These things are not additive. And so you shouldn't think that they are. That's another type of objection to this whole idea of the utilitarian calculus, as it's called. The utilitarians have different particular answers to these different particular objections, but they all come down to this. I just want to summarize. I think they would admit the impossibility, not only difficulty, but the impossibility of doing all that they recommend. But they say, look, we're not trying to give you complete instructions about what must be done if you're ever to decide anything. We're trying to give you kind of a goal to achieve as best you can. I mean, we know that you can't figure out all the effects on all the persons of your various options, but you should do your best. I mean, that's the direction you should pursue. You should try to find out as much as you can about all the effects on as many people as you can. And that's the right data. I mean, that's the thing to be examining. If you, to the extent that you have the time to do this, if you're trying to puzzle out what's the right thing to do, this is the information you should seek. Information about the consequences to people, and in particular, happiness and unhappiness, pleasure and pain that are produced by your action. I mean, that's what we're looking at. So I think this is plainly, I think you can plainly see that this is an absolutist code of ethics. It says that there's something very objective that determines what's right and what's wrong. It might be very difficult to get information about this, difficult to make judgments about which things promote the most happiness in the greatest number of persons over the long run. So that's going to make ethics forever a little bit uncertain. But for the consequentialists, and in particular the utilitarians, it's as objective as you please. I mean, the data it has to do with which things, that I do make you happy, which things hurt you, which things help you. And what I'm supposed to do is those things which maximize the greatest happiness, the greatest number. And far from relying on what societies say, what religions say, what governments say, the utilitarians and consequentialists generally think of themselves as potentially revolutionary. They're saying, I mean, this arose, in fact, in rebellion against an ancient idea of natural law that said that some things are just naturally right and naturally wrong. Sometimes that natural law doctrine was tied to religion, and so it went, there are certain things that God commands that are just naturally right and naturally wrong. Other times it wasn't tied to religion. It said there are certain facts about human nature, the human species, and about the way human society works. We all have certain needs, certain desires, certain basic capacities. And given the kinds of creatures that we are, that means that we have to be treated in certain ways if we're to flourish. So that was another way of approaching the idea of natural law. This way wasn't so religious. It said nature dictates how this particular kind of beast, this human beast, ought to be treated. But the utilitarians thought that this was a disastrous idea. Jeremy Bentham called the idea of natural law, natural rights, nonsense on stilts. Is the idea familiar to you? Natural rights, independent of governments, independent of societies. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights by their Creator. Among these, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration goes on to say, these aren't given by governments. These rights are things that people have. And in the Declaration it says that they're given by God. That's what it says, whether you believe in God or not. Whether you believe in this particular theory or not, it's a perfect illustration of this old natural law theory. And it says that, look, if governments don't respect these rights, I mean, far from governments being the source of them, if governments don't respect these rights, one of the rights that people have is to kick the government out and establish a new one. And what's the purpose of this new government? The same as the purpose of all governments: to protect natural, inalienable rights. You can see we're talking about a rights-based theory of justice. The rights-based theory says there are some things that are wrong and are violations of rights, no matter what the consequence. It doesn't matter how many people are benefited through the death of one innocent person. Killing an innocent person is wrong anyway, and you shouldn't do it. That's what the first 10 Amendments sort of set out, is rights that people have against majorities, against governments. It doesn't matter how many people are benefited by violating a person's right to free speech, by violating a person's right to follow the religious beliefs that they choose. It doesn't matter how many people would be benefited. It's wrong and shall not be permitted. People have inalienable rights on this rights-based theory. Inalienable rights that cannot be taken from them. That's what inalienable means. It means you cannot alienate these rights from the person. Declaration, again, a good example, says that we have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These rights cannot be taken away from us. Now, you might say, well, gee, they certainly can. For example, you lock somebody up. That means you take away their right to freedom. No. On this way of thinking, you can take away a person's freedom by locking them up. But you can't take away their right to freedom. What you do is a violation of their rights. And the cash value of this is, you may think, fairly meager, but in the history of the world it hasn't been so very meager. What this means is the person has the right to resist. If you lock them up, if you take away their freedom, you still haven't taken away their right to freedom. They have a right to resist. If you can murder a person, you can take away their life, but you can only do this by violating their right to life. You have not removed it from them. And you've now eliminated the person, but other people would be, on this view, justified in trying to avenge the death of the person. So the idea of rights-based theories is, the rights-based approach to ethics is, if you want to know which things are right and which things are wrong, consult usually some meager list of fundamental human rights. And while not all the right things can be ascertained in this way, you can ascertain pretty promptly what the wrong things are. It's wrong to violate human rights. Where do they come from? Well, maybe they come from God on some theories. Maybe they come from some natural fact about human beings or human society on other theories. But they're based in nature, one way or the other. We're not yet to Kant's version. Kant had another idea. Kant felt that he could base an understanding of right and wrong more or less on logic. Kant I use as a representative of this broader view called internalism. So is the natural law, natural rights theory. They too are largely internalistic. And what that means is some things are right and some things are wrong in spite of the consequences, no matter what the consequences might be. The consequentialists say, no, sometimes you're going to have to, there's just about nothing that is set in stone as being wrong. Everything depends on the consequences. Sometimes the consequentialist might argue it might be perfectly appropriate to kill an innocent person. It might be the right thing to do, even a morally obligatory thing to do. We'll get to that in a moment. And the internalists, the rights theorists, and Kant would argue no. No, there are some things that are wrong regardless of the consequences. Usually like the killing of an innocent person. But again, it's risky business trying to figure out which particular things they are that would be particular things that would be wrong no matter what. But the key thing that the internalists and the natural rights theorists have in common is that they reject the idea that right can be determined by consequences alone, assessing the consequences. Kant offered a principle called the categorical imperative, as being the fundamental principle of all ethics. It helps inform us of which things are right and which things are wrong. It's a philosopher's version of, or it comes close to being a philosopher's version of the golden rule. It doesn't say exactly do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but it does say this. Anytime I'm trying to decide whether I should do something, I should see if I could generalize that into a general principle for all of mankind. So that, for example, if I'm trying to decide whether to steal something or not, I should ask myself, could I generalize that into a principle that I would be happy, that I could, no, I'm sorry, not happy, that I could consistently generalize to cover everyone. So let me write that down. This is the question I should ask. Can I generalize this maxim, the principle, I'm just going to use maxim because that's his word, the principle that's guiding my behavior, like I should steal in such and such circumstances. Can I generalize this maxim consistently so that it becomes a general rule? For all of mankind. Kant thought that there would be logical problems with the things that were clearly wrong. So that, for example, if I said, could I generalize the practice of stealing so that I said, well, anybody should be allowed to steal whenever they feel the need? Well, if that were the rule, if that were the general social rule, a funny thing would happen. The whole institution of property would wind up getting wiped out. I mean, if stealing is okay, is morally all right, then stealing itself winds up not being possible. I mean, stealing is the wrongful taking of somebody else's property. But if stealing becomes all right, then we wind up modifying our understanding of possessions in such a way as to make the whole practice of stealing itself impossible. Another example. If I were considering whether to lie, I have to ask myself, well, could I generalize this idea that people can lie whenever they want to? Could I generalize that in such a way as to cover everybody, as to make that the general rule for society? Well, if I did, then no one would expect truth-telling, right? I mean, if the general rule was lie whenever you want, no one would expect truth-telling. And the consequence of that would be that lying would lose its meaningfulness. There would no longer be such a thing as lying. I mean, because lying is just saying false things when the expectation is that you'd be saying true things. You change that expectation, then lying becomes impossible. So Kant thought you could wind up figuring out which are the wrong things on almost a logical basis. You try generalizing them, and if it turns out that you can't consistently do that without undermining the very thing you propose to do, well, then that would be wrong. The only things that you are allowed to do are things which you can consistently generalize into maxims. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that particular formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, but I wanted to acquaint you with it anyway. All of these internalistic views say whether something's right or wrong can be determined not by looking at the outside consequences of action based on the principle, but rather by looking inside, looking at the rule itself, looking at human nature, looking at something that's other than the consequences. The consequentialists say, no, what's right, what's wrong depends upon the consequences. Now, here is a method of reasoning that anyway would be approved by the consequentialists. It's the method of reasoning that was used in the decision to drop a nuclear weapon over Hiroshima in August of 1945. I mean, the argument went like this. We know, I mean, the U.S. government not only knew that there would be innocent people killed in that blast, the target was chosen because there were innocent people who would be killed in that blast. There were military targets that were rejected because they would not have satisfied the conditions necessary for this for their argument. The argument went like this: if we don't stop this war now, there's going to be millions of people, Japanese, Americans, and others, killed over the next year if this war keeps going. Millions. I mean, that was something that they thought they could project with fair accuracy. The only way to stop this war is to demoralize the country completely. We need to stop this war not only in the minds of a couple of commanders, but in the minds of the people, in the minds of the emperor, in the minds of everybody. We've got to do something very, very dramatic. We need something very big. So the target was chosen of Hiroshima. And then if there was no surrender within a certain period of time, another city would be blown up. And it was, Nagasaki. 125,000 people, I think, were killed in Hiroshima, roughly. Another 75,000 or so were killed in Nagasaki a short time later. So a total of 200,000 people killed. The reasoning was consequentialist. Now, I do not say that consequentialists, utilitarians, would necessarily approve of this particular conclusion. They might not really think that what this did was to, in the end, promote the greatest good for the greatest number. But the style of reasoning is consequentialist. Because the administration, the Truman administration, decided we should drop the bomb. We should drop it to save lives. We know they said we know that the innocent people will be killed, but we must do this to save other lives later. Having told you that story, I'm not going to pass judgment on it. That's the kind of reasoning that's licensed, by consequentialism. It's also can give you some idea and feel for the horror, I think, with which anti-consequentialists, internalists, look at that methodology. They're saying, look what we could license. Look what we could license if we followed the advice of the consequentialists. And the consequentialists say, sometimes it's necessary. Okay, see you next time.